A billionaire visits his son's grave and finds a black waitress crying with a child. He was shocked. What would you do if you discovered that the son you thought you knew had been living a completely different life? A secret existence filled with passion, defiance, and a love so powerful it would challenge everything you believed about family, class, and the human heart? Have you ever felt like you failed someone you loved? Have you ever wondered what secrets your family might be hiding behind closed doors? Have you ever looked at someone close to you and realized that maybe, just maybe, you never really knew them at all? This billionaire thought he knew everything about his deceased son, until he found a stranger crying at his grave, a woman whose very presence would force him to confront the most painful truth of his life. What he discovered next would shatter everything he believed about love, family, and forgiveness. And before this story ends, you will understand why some secrets are powerful enough to transform even the coldest heart. But first, let me take you inside the mind of a man who had everything money could buy, yet possessed nothing that truly mattered. Alaric Voss didn't just own companies. He devoured them. At 62, his name commanded respect in boardrooms across 3 continents. His steel-gray eyes had witnessed hostile takeovers, crushed competitors, and built an empire worth billions. But today, standing at the ornate gates of Greenwood Cemetery, those same eyes held something his business rivals had never seen: raw, unfiltered pain. The autumn wind cut through his expensive coat as he walked a familiar path. Each step echoed with the weight of regret that had haunted him for exactly 1 year, 3 months, and 16 days. That's how long it had been since Cashin, his only son, his heir, his greatest disappointment, had died in that car accident. The headstone came into view, and Alaric's breath caught in his throat. Cashin Voss, beloved son, artist, dreamer. The words artist and dreamer had been added against his wishes. Even in death, his son continued to rebel against everything Alaric had tried to build. He knelt beside the polished marble, his knees pressing into the damp earth. "Another year, son," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly. "Another year of wondering if things could have been different." The memories flooded back, their last argument, the harsh words about responsibility and family legacy, the way Cashin's face had hardened when Alaric called his art a waste of time and talent. He'd been trying to prepare his son for the real world, for the brutal reality of business and wealth. Instead, he'd driven him away. "I thought I was protecting you," Alaric continued, his fingers tracing the engraved letters. "I thought if I made you strong enough, tough enough, you'd survive anything. But I was wrong about so many things." The guilt gnawed at him like a living thing. He'd spent 30 years building walls around his emotions, teaching himself that feelings were weakness, that love was a luxury he couldn't afford. He'd passed that same cold philosophy to his son, never realizing he was slowly killing the very thing he was trying to protect. As he sat there in the gathering dusk, Alaric couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial. The private investigators had given him the facts about the accident: wet roads, late night, no other vehicles involved. But they couldn't explain the strange piece on Cashin's face in those final photos, or the stack of paintings they'd found in his apartment, all depicting the same mysterious woman, the woman with the radiant smile and knowing eyes, the woman whose face had haunted Alaric's dreams for over a year. Who was she? Why had Cashin painted her so obsessively? And why did every brushstroke seem to pulse with a love so profound it made Alaric's chest ache with longing? He'd hired the best art experts money could buy, but they could only tell him about technique and style. They couldn't explain why these paintings felt like love letters written in color and light. They couldn't decode the secret messages hidden in every shadow and curve. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain and dying leaves. Alaric closed his eyes, remembering the last time he'd seen his son alive. Cashin had been rushing out of the family mansion, a canvas tucked under his arm, his eyes bright with something that looked almost like joy. "Where are you going?" Alaric had demanded. "To live," Cashin had replied simply. "Something you wouldn't understand." Those had been their final words to each other. To live. What had his son meant by that? What kind of life had he been living that his own father knew nothing about? The questions tormented him daily. Had Cashin been happy? Had he found love? Had he found the kind of meaning that Alaric's fortune could never buy? The not knowing was slowly destroying him from the inside out. As darkness began to settle over the cemetery, Alaric made a promise to the cold marble stone. I'm going to find out who you really were, son. I'm going to understand the man you became when you walked away from everything I offered you. He had no idea that tomorrow would bring him face to face with the truth he'd been seeking. He had no idea that the woman in those paintings was real, that she was closer than he'd ever dare hope, and that she carried secrets that would change everything. If you've ever struggled with family secrets, hit that subscribe button. You're going to want to hear this entire story, because what happens next will prove that sometimes the most powerful discoveries happen when we're brave enough to face the truth about the people we love. The next morning arrived gray and cold, matching the storm clouds gathering in Alaric's chest. He'd barely slept, his mind racing with questions that had no answers. By dawn, he was already dressed and heading back to Greenwood Cemetery, drawn by an invisible force he couldn't name. As his black sedan pulled through the gates, something felt different. The groundskeeper waved, unusual for a man who typically kept to himself. A few early mourners moved between the headstones, but their presence felt charged, expectant. Alaric shook off the strange sensation and walked toward Cashin's grave. What he saw there stopped him cold. A woman knelt beside the headstone, her dark hair falling like a curtain around her face. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs, and her fingers traced Cashin's name with the familiarity of someone who'd done this countless times before. But it wasn't just her presence that jolted him. It was the child. A boy, maybe 10 years old, sat cross-legged on the grass nearby. He wasn't playing or fidgeting like most children his age would. Instead, he was sketching in a worn notebook, his hand moving with practiced precision across the page. The concentration on his young face was intense, almost professional. Alaric approached slowly, his footsteps muffled by the damp earth. The woman didn't notice him, lost in her private grief. But the boy looked up, and when their eyes met, Alaric felt the world shift beneath his feet. Those eyes, deep brown, intelligent, with flecks of gold that caught the morning light. He'd seen those exact eyes before, staring back at him from his bathroom mirror every morning for 62 years. They were Voss eyes, unmistakable. "You're him?" the boy said quietly, his voice carrying a maturity that didn't match his age. "The man from the paintings." Alaric's throat went dry. "What paintings?" The boy closed his notebook and stood, brushing grass from his jeans. "The ones in our apartment. Mama says they're of someone important, someone who never knew how to love properly." He tilted his head, studying Alaric with uncomfortable intensity. "You remind me of someone in the paintings." The woman, Zariah, though Alaric didn't know her name yet, finally looked up. Her tear-streaked face was beautiful in a way that suffering sometimes makes a person beautiful, raw and honest and completely unguarded. When she saw Alaric, her expression shifted through a series of emotions: surprise, recognition, fear, and something that might have been anger. "Elias," she said sharply, reaching for the boy's hand. "We need to go." But Elias didn't move. He was still staring at Alaric with those familiar eyes, and suddenly he smiled, a smile that was pure Cashin, mischievous and warm and completely disarming. "Are you my grandfather?" The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Zariah's face went pale. "Elias, please." "It's okay, Mama." The boy's voice was gentle, mature beyond his years. "He needs to know. Cashin told me he would figure out eventually. He said his father was smart, just broken." Alaric felt his legs give out. He sank onto a nearby bench, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. The notebook slipped from Elias's hands, and sketches scattered across the grass. Alaric caught one, a perfect portrait of Cashin, drawn with the skill of someone who'd studied his subject with loving attention. "You knew him?" Alaric whispered, his voice barely audible. Zariah stood slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. She wore a simple black dress that had seen better days, but she carried herself with a dignity that made Alaric think of royalty. "I loved him," she said simply, "and he loved me more than you'll ever understand." The words hit Alaric like physical blows. His son had been in love. His son had been happy. His son had found someone who looked at him the way Zariah was looking at this child, with fierce, protective devotion. "How long?" Alaric asked. 3 years, Zariah replied, her voice steady despite the tears still flowing down her cheeks. 3 years of hiding. 3 years of pretending we didn't exist because he knew what you'd do if you found out. Elias picked up another sketch. This one of Zariah laughing, her head thrown back in pure joy. He drew her all the time, the boy said conversationally, said she was his light in the darkness, said she made him remember what it felt like to be alive. The words from their final conversation echoed in Alaric's mind. To live. Something you wouldn't understand. "You're the woman in the paintings," Alaric said, pieces clicking together in his mind. "The ones in his apartment." Zariah nodded. "He painted me because he couldn't take pictures. Too risky. Someone might find them." Her voice carried a bitterness that cut through Alaric's chest. He was so afraid of disappointing you that he lived his whole life in secret. "And the child is your grandson," Zariah finished, "whether you want him or not." Alaric looked at Elias again, really looked at him. The boy had Cashin's artistic talent, his mother's quiet strength, and the Voss eyes that had been passed down through generations. But there was something else there, too, a light that Alaric recognized but couldn't name. "He doesn't know," Elias said suddenly, as if reading his thoughts. "About the accident. About why Cashin was driving so fast that night." Zariah's face crumpled. "Elias, no." "He has a right to know, Mama." Cashin said truth was the only thing that could heal his father's heart. Alaric felt the ground shifting beneath him again. "What truth?" The boy walked over to his mother, taking her hand in his small one. "Tell him about the letter, Mama. Tell him about the choice Cashin was going to make." Zariah closed her eyes, and when she opened them, they were filled with a pain so deep it made Alaric's chest ache. "He was coming to see you that night. He'd finally found the courage to tell you about us. About me. About Elias." The world stopped spinning. Cashin had been coming home. After 3 years of hiding, of living in secret, his son had been ready to face him, ready to fight for his family. "The letter is still in his jacket pocket," Zariah whispered. "The one he never got to deliver." "The letter?" Alaric stared at Zariah with desperate eyes. "Where is it? Where is this letter?" Zariah hesitated, her fingers unconsciously moving to the small gold locket at her throat. "At home. I keep it with me. I couldn't bear to read it at first, but when I finally did," her voice broke. "He was going to choose us. He was going to risk everything." "Show me," Alaric said, standing abruptly. "Please, I need to understand." Elias looked between the two adults, his young face serious. "She's scared you'll hate her when you know the whole truth." "What truth?" Alaric's voice was barely a whisper. Zariah took a shuddering breath. "How we met, what I was to him, what he gave up for me." She looked directly into Alaric's eyes. "Your son didn't just fall in love with a waitress. He fell in love with a woman who was running from her past, hiding secrets that could have destroyed both our lives." The ride to Zariah's apartment was silent, except for Elias's quiet humming in the back seat. Alaric's mind raced with questions, but he sensed that pushing now would only make Zariah retreat further. When they arrived at the modest building in the heart of the city, Alaric was struck by how different this neighborhood was from his world of gated communities and private security. Inside the small apartment, Alaric's breath caught. The walls were covered with Cashin's artwork, not just paintings, but sketches, charcoal drawings, watercolors. All of Zariah. In some, she was laughing. In others, she was reading. In one particularly striking piece, She was dancing alone in what looked like this very apartment, her arms raised, her face radiant with joy. He painted me because he said I was the first person who made him feel real. Zariah said softly, watching Alaric study the artwork. But I need you to understand how we met, because it wasn't romantic. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was broken people finding each other in the darkness. She moved to a small wooden box on the kitchen counter and withdrew a folded piece of paper. This is the letter. But first, let me tell you the story he was too scared to tell you himself. Zariah settled into a worn armchair, Elias curling up beside her. It was March 15th, 3 years ago. I was working the night shift at Mel's Diner on 5th Street. You know, the one, the place where people go when they have nowhere else to go. Alaric nodded. He'd driven past it countless times, never giving it a second thought. I was in trouble that night. Real trouble. My ex-boyfriend had found me, and he wasn't the kind of man who accepted no for an answer. I'd been hiding from him for months, but he tracked me down through a friend. He came into the diner around midnight, drunk and angry. Zariah's voice grew quiet. He grabbed me, right there in front of everyone, started dragging me toward the door, saying I belonged to him. The other customers looked away. They always do. But then this man stood up from a corner booth. She smiled, and for the first time, Alaric saw a glimpse of the woman Cashin had fallen in love with. He was so calm. Your son walked over and said, I believe the lady asked you to let her go. My ex laughed. Here was this rich boy in his expensive coat, thinking he could play hero. What happened? Cashin didn't fight him. He did something completely unexpected. He pulled out his phone and started recording. Said he was live streaming to his social media followers, that this was about to go viral. My ex panicked. He had warrants out for his arrest. He let me go and ran. Alaric felt a surge of pride in his son, mixed with shame that he'd never known this story. Cashin saved me that night, Zariah continued. But he didn't just save me and leave. He stayed, helped me clean up the mess, made sure I got home safely, asked if I needed help finding somewhere else to work, somewhere safer. She paused. I told him I'd been a lawyer once, before everything fell apart, before I had to disappear. The revelation hit Alaric like a physical blow. A lawyer? Harvard Law, class of 2018. I was working at Morrison & Associates when I met my ex. He was a client, charming, successful, dangerous. When I tried to leave him, he threatened to destroy my career. He had connections, money, power. So I ran, changed my name, took whatever work I could find. Alaric stared at this woman, this brilliant, accomplished woman, who had been reduced to hiding in plain sight. And Cashin knew? Not at first. That came later, after we... She trailed off, her cheeks flushing slightly. After you what? Zariah looked at Elias, who was pretending to read a book, but clearly listening. After we became more than friends. The first time it happened was 6 weeks after they met. Cashin had been coming to the diner every few days, always ordering coffee and pie, always sitting in the same corner booth. He claimed he was there to work on his art, but Zariah knew he was really there to make sure she was safe. One night, I was walking home after my shift, and it started pouring rain. Cashin was waiting outside. He always walked me home those first few weeks. We ducked into the doorway of a closed bookstore, and we were standing so close I could feel his heartbeat. Zariah's voice became softer, more intimate. He looked at me and said, I know this is crazy, but I think I'm falling in love with you. Just like that. No games, no pretense. Pure honesty. And what did you say? I told him he was an idiot, that I was broken, that I had nothing to offer him but trouble. But he just smiled and said, I'm not looking for perfect. I'm looking for real. That night, in the rain-soaked doorway, Zariah had let herself be vulnerable for the first time in years. When Cashin reached up to brush a raindrop from her cheek, she didn't pull away. When he leaned in to kiss her, she met him halfway. It was like coming alive, she whispered. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be touched with tenderness instead of possession. Their first real night together was 2 months later. Cashin had rented a small studio apartment across town, somewhere they could be alone, away from prying eyes. He'd filled it with canvases and art supplies, but also with small touches that showed he'd been thinking about her. Fresh flowers, her favorite tea, books of poetry. He painted me that first night, Zariah said, her voice growing husky with memory. Said he wanted to capture the way I looked when I felt safe. I was nervous. I'd never modeled before, never let anyone see me so exposed. She moved to one of the paintings on the wall, a nude study done in warm, golden tones. It was tasteful, artistic, but undeniably intimate. He started with my hands. Said they told the story of everything I'd survived. Then my shoulders, my neck. Each brushstroke felt like a caress. Alaric found himself drawn into the memory, seeing his son through Zariah's eyes. When he finished the painting, he set down his brush and just looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before, complete acceptance. He saw my scars, my fear, my broken pieces, and he thought I was beautiful. What happened next? Zariah's cheeks flushed deeper. He crossed the room and knelt beside me, took my hands in his and said, I want to love you the way you deserve to be loved, not possessively, not selfishly, but completely. Is that okay? The intimacy that followed was unlike anything Zariah had ever experienced. Cashin's touch was reverent, patient, healing. He kissed each scar on her arms, whispered affirmations against her skin, made love to her with an intensity that was both passionate and deeply respectful. He made me feel like art, Zariah said softly, like I was something precious being created rather than something damaged being used. For 3 years, they maintained their secret world. Cashin would spend his days in his father's corporate offices, playing the role of dutiful heir, then escape to their hidden sanctuary in the evenings. He painted obsessively, as if trying to capture every moment of their happiness before it could be taken away. He was terrified of losing me, Zariah said, but he was equally terrified of losing you. He loved you, Alaric. Despite everything, he wanted your approval, your acceptance. Then why didn't he tell me? Zariah handed him the letter. Because he knew what you'd see when you looked at me. Not the lawyer, not the survivor, not the woman who loved your son. You'd see the black waitress with a criminal ex-boyfriend who was trying to trap your heir. Alaric opened the letter with trembling hands. In Cashin's familiar handwriting, he read, Dad, I know I've been a disappointment to you. I know you think I'm weak, that I'm wasting my life on foolish dreams. But I need you to know that I've found something worth fighting for. Her name is Zariah, and she's going to be my wife. The letter went on for 3 pages, detailing Cashin's plans to propose, his desire to bring Zariah and Elias into the family, his hope that love could bridge the gap between their worlds. He was coming to tell you that night, Zariah said through her tears. He was going to risk everything for us. Comment below if you believe love can truly conquer all social barriers, because what happens next will test that belief. Alaric's hands shook as he finished reading the letter. The words blurred through his tears, but one phrase stood out like a beacon. I'm not choosing her over you, Dad. I'm choosing love over fear. I hope someday you'll understand the difference. He looked up at Zariah, who was watching him with careful eyes. He was going to propose. The ring is in the music box on the shelf, Elias said quietly. He showed it to me the day before, said he was going to ask Mama to marry him, then take me to meet my grandfather. Alaric's heart shattered completely. His son had been planning to bring them together, to create the family Alaric had unknowingly been longing for. I would have said yes, he whispered. If he'd brought you to me, if he'd asked for my blessing, I would have said yes. Zariah's expression softened slightly. You think that now, but 3 years ago, when all you knew was that your heir was dating a black waitress with a complicated past. The brutal honesty of her words hit him like a slap. She was right, and they both knew it. There's something else, Zariah said, standing and moving to a wooden trunk in the corner. Something I've never shown anyone, not even the police after the accident. She pulled out a leather-bound journal, its pages thick with pressed flowers and dried paint. Cashin kept this. Every moment we shared, every conversation, every... She paused, her cheeks flushing. Every intimate encounter. He documented it all. Alaric's eyebrows rose. Why? Because he said our love was too beautiful to trust a memory alone. He wanted proof that it had existed, that it had been real. Zariah clutched the journal to her chest. He was terrified that if something happened to him, I convinced myself it had all been a dream. She opened the journal to a random page and began to read aloud. March 23rd. Zariah laughed today when I spilled paint on my shirt. Not a polite laugh, but the kind that comes from deep in your belly. I've never heard anything more beautiful. I painted her laugh tonight, gold and orange and warm bronze. I think I'm beginning to understand what happiness actually looks like. Alaric felt his chest tighten. His son had been happy. Genuinely, completely happy. Zariah flipped to another page. June 15th. She told me about her nightmares today. How her ex used to wake her up with his hands around her throat, just to remind her who was in control. When she finished talking, she apologized for dumping her baggage on me. I told her that loving someone means carrying their pain with them, not making them carry it alone. She cried then, and I held her until she fell asleep. I understand now why she flinches when I move too quickly. I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving that not all men are monsters. He saw you, Alaric said quietly. Really saw you. And I saw him. Zariah's voice was fierce with pride. Not the billionaire's son, not the heir to an empire. I saw the man who stayed up all night when I had fever, who learned to braid my hair because I mentioned missing my mother, who cried when he painted because he was so moved by beauty. She flipped to a section near the back of the journal, her face growing more serious. But there's something else. Something that changes everything about that night. Alaric leaned forward. What? Read this entry. It's from the morning of the accident. Alaric took the journal, his eyes scanning Cashin's familiar handwriting. I can't do this anymore. The lying, the hiding, the pretending. Zariah deserves better than stolen moments and secret apartments. Elias deserves to know his grandfather, to grow up without shame about who he is. I'm going to tell Dad everything tonight. If he disowns me, if he cuts me off, so be it. I'd rather be poor and honest than rich and hollow. I'm going to ask him to walk me down the aisle when I marry the love of my life. But it was the next paragraph that made Alaric's blood run cold. Marcus called today. Zariah's ex found us. He's been watching the apartment, following her to work. He threatened to hurt Elias if she doesn't come back to him. I can't let that happen. I'm going to Dad tonight, not just to tell him about my family, but to ask for his help, his connections, his security team, his power. For the first time in my life, I need to be a boss. I need to use everything Dad taught me about fighting to protect the people I love. The journal slipped from Alaric's fingers. He wasn't just coming to confess. He was coming for help. Marcus had been escalating for weeks, Zariah said, her voice hollow, making threats, showing up at my work, following Elias to school. Cashin was terrified, but he was also determined. He said he was done letting other people's hate control our lives. Alaric stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, storm clouds were gathering, matching the tempest in his chest. And I wasn't there. When my son finally needed me, when he was ready to be part of this family, I wasn't there. You were there, Elias said suddenly. Both adults turned to look at him. The night of the accident. You were there. Alaric frowned. What do you mean? At the house. Cashin called you from the car. I heard him talking to Mama about it. Elias's young face was serious. He said you were waiting for him in your study, that you'd agreed to see him even though it was late. The memory hit Alaric like a physical blow. He had been waiting. Cashin had called. said he needed to talk, that it was important. Alaric had agreed, then sat in his study for hours, practicing what he would say, how he would finally bridge the gap between them. I waited until 3 in the morning, Alaric whispered. When he didn't show, I assumed he'd change his mind. I thought he was too much of a coward to face me. He was driving to you when it happened, Zariah said softly. The police said he was speeding, but I knew he was just desperate to get there. He'd been planning this conversation for weeks. The irony was devastating. Father and son, both ready to reconcile, both willing to fight for family, separated by cruel fate and a rain-slicked road. I need to see it, Alaric said suddenly. The accident site. I need to understand what happened. Zariah shook her head. It won't change anything. It will change everything. Alaric's voice was raw with emotion. My son died trying to come home to me. He died trying to protect your family. Our family. Thunder rumbled outside, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Zariah looked at Elias, who nodded solemnly. Then we go together, she said. All of us. It's time you knew the whole truth about that night. As they prepared to leave, Alaric caught sight of his reflection in the hallway mirror. The man staring back at him was older and more broken, but also somehow more human than he'd been in years. His son's love had changed him, even in death. Zariah, he said as she gathered her coat, when we get back, I want to discuss something. About Elias's future, about your future, about making sure Marcus never threatens his family again. She looked at him with cautious hope. What are you saying? I'm saying that my son made a choice that night. He chose love over fear, family over fortune. It's time I made the same choice. The accident site was a nondescript stretch of highway, unremarkable except for the fresh flowers someone had left by the guardrail. As their car pulled over, Alaric felt his chest tighten. This was where his son had taken his last breath, where every possibility for reconciliation had died in twisted metal and broken glass. But as they stood in the rain, something unexpected happened. Instead of succumbing to grief, Alaric felt a cold, focused rage building in his chest. Not at Cashin, not at fate, but at the man who had driven his son to desperation. Marcus, he said quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. Tell me everything about Marcus. Zariah looked startled by the sudden shift in his tone. Alaric, what are you thinking? I'm thinking that my son died trying to protect his family from a threat I should have eliminated years ago. Alaric pulled out his phone, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. I'm thinking it's time Marcus learned what happens when you threaten a boss. Within minutes, Alaric had his head of security on the line. James, I need a full background check on a Marcus Dwyer. Criminal history, current location, associates, weaknesses. I want everything within the hour. Dad, you can't just... Zariah began, then stopped herself. I mean, Mr. Voss. You call me Dad, Alaric said, his expression softening slightly. Don't take it back now. The vulnerability in his voice made Zariah's defenses crumble a little. This isn't how normal families handle things. We're not a normal family, Elias said matter-of-factly. Grandfather has resources most people don't have. If someone is threatening us, why wouldn't he use them? Alaric looked at his grandson with new respect. Smart boy. You get that from your mother. And my stubbornness from my father, Elias replied with a slight smile. Mama says I argue like Cashin used to. The casual mention of his son's name no longer felt like a knife to the chest. Instead, it felt like a bridge, a connection to a part Cashin's life he'd never known existed. Tell me about him, Alaric said suddenly. Not the artist, not the lover. Tell me about Cashin as a father figure. Zariah's expression grew tender. He was magical with Elias, patient in ways I never expected. He'd spend hours teaching him to draw, to see the world through an artist's eyes. But he also taught him practical things. How to change a tire, how to cook, how to stand up for himself without using violence. He taught me that being a man isn't about being the strongest or the richest, Elias added. It's about protecting the people you love and being brave enough to show your feelings. The words hit Alaric like a revelation. His son had learned to be the father that Alaric had never known how to be. I want to learn, Alaric said quietly. I want to know how to be the grandfather he would have wanted me to be. Over the next few hours, as they waited for information about Marcus, something remarkable happened. Alaric began to see the world through Cashin's eyes. When they stopped for lunch at a small cafe, he watched Uriah interact with the waitress, not as someone beneath her, but as an equal. When Elias asked questions about his business, Alaric found himself explaining not just what he did, but why it mattered to real people. Cashin used to say that money was just a tool, Zariah said as they shared a plate of fries. He said the real measure of a man was what he built with it. What did he want to build? Art programs for kids who couldn't afford them. Scholarships for students like me who needed second chances. Places where people could create instead of just consume. Alaric felt a spark of excitement he hadn't experienced in years. We could do that, in his name, make his dreams real. We. Zariah's voice was cautious. You, me, Elias, a family. Alaric's phone buzzed with a text from his security team. But first we handle Marcus. The information was more extensive than Alaric had expected. Marcus Dwyer wasn't just an abusive ex-boyfriend. He was a mid-level criminal with connections to drug trafficking and money laundering. He'd been using his relationship with Zariah to legitimize his operations, claiming her legal expertise when dealing with authorities. He's been watching you for 3 years, Alaric said, scrolling through the report. Not just stalking, using you. He's been telling people you're still his lawyer, still working with him. Zariah's face went pale. That's impossible. I know you didn't. But he's been forging documents with your name, using your old law firm credentials. That's why he won't let you go. You're not just his ex-girlfriend. You're his unwitting accomplice. The implications were staggering. Marcus hadn't just been possessive. He'd been deliberately framing Zariah for his crimes. We need to call the police, Zariah said, but Alaric shook his head. The police will take months to build a case. Marcus will disappear, or worse, he'll escalate. No, we handle this the way Cashin would have wanted. We protect our family first, then we make sure justice is served. That evening, Alaric made a series of calls that would have impressed his son. He contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, offering to cooperate in exchange for immunity for Zariah. He hired the city's best criminal defense attorney to represent her interests. He arranged for round-the-clock security for both Zariah and Elias. But the most important call was to his own board of directors. I'm announcing my retirement, he said during an emergency meeting. My grandson will inherit my shares when he comes of age, managed by a trust that will be administered by his mother. The room erupted in protest, but Alaric raised his hand for silence. My son died trying to build a bridge between two worlds. I'm going to finish what he started. Later that night, as Zariah tucked Elias into bed in the guest room of Alaric's mansion, she found herself wondering if she was dreaming. 24 hours ago, she'd been a single mother working double shifts to pay rent. Now she was living in a palace, with a billionaire who insisted she call him Dad. It's too much, she told Alaric as they sat in his study, surrounded by the portraits of long-dead Voss ancestors. I can't be responsible for your fortune. You're not responsible for my fortune, Alaric replied. You're responsible for my grandson's future. There's a difference. And what about us? What are we to each other? Alaric considered the question carefully. We're family, not by blood but by choice, by love, by the memory of a man who saw something in both of us worth fighting for. He stood and walked to his desk, retrieving a small velvet box. This was going to be yours anyway. Cashin bought it with his own money, not mine. I think you should have it. Inside was the engagement ring Cashin had never gotten to give her, a simple solitaire that caught the light and threw rainbows across the room. I can't, Zariah whispered. You can. You should. He chose you, Zariah. Against everything I taught him about power and position and propriety. He chose love. The least I can do is honor that choice. As Zariah slipped the ring onto her finger, she felt something shift inside her chest. Not just grief, but possibility. Not just fear, but hope. If you believe in second chances and redemption, share this story, because the transformation gets even more powerful. Outside, storm clouds were clearing, and the first stars were beginning to shine through the darkness. In the distance, Alaric's security team was already moving against Marcus, ensuring that the threat that killed Cashin would never harm his family again. 6 months later, the abandoned warehouse in downtown Detroit hummed with unexpected life. What had once been a symbol of urban decay now pulsed with color, creativity, and hope. Children's laughter echoed off the high ceilings as young artists worked on massive murals that told stories of resilience and transformation. Alaric stood in the center of it all, his expensive suit replaced by paint-stained jeans and a worn flannel shirt. In his hands was a brush, and on the canvas before him was his first attempt at art, a clumsy but heartfelt portrait of Cashin. "You're holding it too tight," Elias said, appearing at his grandfather's elbow. Cashin always said the brush should feel like an extension of your soul, not a weapon. Easy for him to say, Alaric grumbled, but he relaxed his grip. He had talent. I have stubbornness. Same thing, really, Zariah said, joining them. She wore a simple dress and her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, but the stress lines around her eyes had softened. The engagement ring caught the light as she adjusted Elias's easel. Cashin was the most stubborn person I ever met, present company excluded. The Cashin Foundation had started as a simple scholarship program, but it had evolved into something neither of them had expected. What began as art classes for underprivileged children had become a movement. The foundation didn't just teach art. It used creativity as a bridge between communities that rarely interacted. Mrs. Patterson brought her granddaughter today, Zariah said, gesturing toward an elderly white woman helping a young black girl with her sculpture. 6 months ago, she crossed the street to avoid walking past this building. Now she volunteers here 3 times a week. Alaric watched the interaction with wonder. What changed her mind? Elias did, Zariah replied with pride. He started a project called Paint My Story, where kids interview seniors about their lives, then create art based on what they learn. Mrs. Patterson was matched with Keisha, and they discovered they both lost their husbands in Vietnam. Art became their common language. The program had attracted national attention, but not in the way Alaric had expected. Instead of being praised for his philanthropy, he'd been criticized by some of his former peers for wasting resources on people who don't matter. The comments had stung at first, but they'd also clarified something important. He no longer cared about their approval. "There's something I need to tell you both," Alaric said, setting down his brush. "The board met yesterday. They want to buy out my shares and remove me from the company entirely." Zariah's face went pale. "Because of the foundation?" "Because of us," Alaric corrected. "Because I chose family over profit. Because I'm damaging the brand by associating with people they consider beneath our status." Elias looked confused. "What does that mean?" "It means," Alaric said, kneeling to his grandson's level, "that I'm officially retired, which means I can spend all my time here, with you, learning to paint and building something that actually matters." The unexpected news should have been devastating, but instead, Alaric felt lighter than he had in years. The corporate world that had once defined him now seemed small and hollow, compared to the vibrant community they'd built. "There's something else," Zariah said quietly. "The FBI called. Marcus is going to prison for 20 years. The case is closed." The relief was palpable. For months, they'd lived with the knowledge that Marcus was out there, plotting his return. Now that chapter was finally over. "So what happens now?" Elias asked. "Now we build." Alaric said simply, "We take everything Cashin dreamed of and make it real." 3 months later, on a warm spring morning, The three of them walked through Greenwood Cemetery together. But this time they weren't alone. Behind them walked a small crowd, artists, students, community members, and families whose lives have been touched by the foundation. They'd come to unveil a memorial they created together, a bronze sculpture of Cashin's hands, cast from molds taken from his paintings. The hands were cupped, as if holding something precious, and engraved around the base were words from his final letter. Love is the only truth that matters. He would have loved this, Zariah said, placing a fresh bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the sculpture. All these people coming together, creating something beautiful from pain. Alaric nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He did love this. He saw it before any of us did. As the crowd dispersed, the three of them remained. Alaric had brought his sketchbook, a habit he developed in the months since learning to draw. Today's subject was Elias, who was adding his own flowers to the memorial. "I've been thinking about something," Elias said suddenly. "About names." "What about them?" Zariah asked. "Well, I'm a Monroe because that's Mama's name, but I'm also a Voss because that's Cashin's name. And now I'm kind of both because we're all family." Alaric looked up from his sketch. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe it's time to make it official. Maybe it's time for all of us to be Voss Monroes, or Monroe Voss. I don't care about the order." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. Alaric had spent his entire life believing that family was about bloodlines and legacy. But looking at Zariah and Elias, he realized that family was actually about choice, commitment, and love. "I think," he said slowly, "that's exactly what Cashin would have wanted." As they walked back toward the car, Alaric felt a sense of completion he'd never experienced before. The man who had started this journey as a grief-stricken billionaire was gone. In his place was a grandfather, a partner in purpose, and a guardian of his son's true legacy. The foundation continued to grow, but more importantly, they continued to grow as a family. Not perfect, not traditional, but real. And in the end, that was the only truth that mattered. 1 year later, Alaric stood at the podium of the Detroit Community Center, looking out at an audience he never could have imagined addressing. The room was packed with faces of every color, age, and background, all united by the common thread of art and healing. "A year ago," he began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, "I thought I knew what success looked like. I measure my worth in dollars and deals, in power and position. I was wrong about almost everything." In the front row, Zariah sat beside Elias, both beaming with pride, but it was the unexpected face in the third row that made Alaric's heart skip. Margaret Thornton, the chairman of his former company's board, the woman who had orchestrated his removal, now sat listening intently to his words. "I lost my son because I was too afraid to see him clearly," Alaric continued. "I was so busy protecting him from a world I thought would hurt him that I never realized I was the one causing the pain. Tonight, I want to tell you how a 10-year-old boy taught me that courage isn't about having no fear. It's about choosing love despite the fear." The speech wasn't planned. Alaric had come to the center's anniversary celebration expecting to stay in the background, but when the scheduled speaker canceled, Elias had stood up and announced, "My grandfather has something to say." "The foundation we built wasn't my idea," Alaric said, his eyes finding Elias in the crowd. "It was the dream of a man who saw past the barriers that divide us. My son Cashin believed that art could heal wounds, bridge differences, and create families where none existed before. He was right." As if on cue, a group of teenagers took the stage. Kids from the Foundation's first art class, now seniors in high school. They created a multimedia presentation about their experience, but what they shared wasn't just about learning to paint or sculpt. It was about learning to see themselves as valuable, to see their stories as worth telling. "Mr. Voss taught me that my background doesn't define my future," said Maria, a 17-year-old whose murals now decorated buildings across the city. "He showed me that being different isn't something to hide. It's something to celebrate. Mrs. Zariah taught me that being smart isn't about where you went to school," added Jamal, who just received a full scholarship to MIT. It's about how you use your mind to help others. But it was a final speaker who delivered the most powerful message. Elias, now 11 and taller than but a year ago, stepped up to the microphone with the confidence of someone who'd found his voice. I used to think families were supposed to look alike, he said, his young voice carrying clearly through the room. I thought they were supposed to have the same skin color, the same last name, the same everything. But my family taught me that love doesn't care about any of that stuff. He looked directly at Alaric, then at Zariah. My dad, Cashin, loved my mom, even though people said they were too different. My grandfather chose us even though we weren't born into his world. And my mom loved us both enough to let us become a real family. The audience was silent, hanging on every word. I'm going to tell this story for the rest of my life, Elias continued, not because it's perfect, but because it's true, because it shows that even when everything seems broken, love can put it back together in ways that are even more beautiful than before. After the presentation, Margaret Thornton approached Alaric with tears in her eyes. I owe you an apology, she said quietly. I thought you were having a breakdown when you chose him over the company. I didn't understand that you were actually having a breakthrough. What changed your mind? Alaric asked. My granddaughter started attending your art classes, she replied. She came home talking about her friend Elias, about how he taught her that families come in all shapes and sizes. She asked me why I fired the nicest grandfather she'd ever met. I didn't have a good answer. That night, as they walked home through the city streets, Alaric reflected on the journey that had brought them here. A billionaire who'd learned that wealth meant nothing without love. A brilliant woman who discovered that her past didn't define her future. A child who taught two adults that family wasn't about blood. It was about choice. Do you think Cashin would be proud? Zariah asked, slipping her hand into his. I think he'd be amazed, Alaric replied. He set out to save us, but in the end, we saved each other. Elias ran ahead, then turned back to face them. When I'm older, I'm going to write a book about this, about how love can change everything, even when it seems impossible. What will you call it? Zariah asked. The day my grandfather learned to love, Elias said without hesitation, because that's when everything really began. Subscribe if you believe that every ending can become a new beginning. And hit that notification bell, because next week's story will blow your mind just as much.